Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. What is Needience? We are going to look at that later on in the video when we talk to Amanda Sukenick, who has constructed this concept. But before that, let's look at some news about antinatalism. Bree Lee is an Australian author and has written many books. Her latest book, Seed, has antinatalistic themes in it, and we have covered this in the past episodes of ATW. So that is not the news. But she has written a Substack entry, My Last Ever Spicy Antinatalism Essay. Over the past many days, she has been giving many interviews about her book, and in one such podcast, she explained her position about not having children. Her reasons to not have kids is the anxiety about degrading environment and issues like climate change. In the interview, she explained that what she wants is a choice to make a decision about having or not having children which is free of climate anxiety, and that this choice is not available to her generation anymore. The Substack entry starts with a reaction to the comments on internet about her position. She claims that she rarely discusses her personal position about having children or not having children as opposed to the ethics of having children. And the reason for that is slightly controversial, where she says when women talk about parental ambivalence, they are indecisive, and when men talk about parental ambivalence, they are philosophers. She discloses that she is not an antinatalist. I do not consider myself as an antinatalist, but the antinatalist philosophy has much to offer us, and if our beliefs cannot withstand an antinatalist examination, then it is worthwhile asking ourselves why. She is spot on about why people seem to have children. Their reasons don't involve the well being of the prospective child. One of the most common answers people give when they are asked why they want to have a child is some version of what that child can do for me. And these versions could be I want somebody to take care of me when I'm old, or I want a new generation to pay for the pensions of my generation, or to help economy growing or sustaining, and so on. These reasons stem from what parents believe and the problems that they have, which the prospective child has no interest in solving. Breeley categorizes these reasons into two groups: intergenerational and intergroup. The intergenerational reason to have children is like a procreational Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme. There is a pyramid like hierarchy where those at the top benefit from the recruitment of those at the bottom. The recruitment has to continue, otherwise, the whole pyramid collapses. This is similar to having more children to maintain economy, so that those who are already recruited and are in the pyramid are benefited by the continuation of the system. But the new recruits, which in the case of procreation, the younger people, are the ones who are the most vulnerable to the suffering if the pyramid collapses. And so, to have children, even after knowing this, demonstrates a lack of empathy for the younger generation, and hence the comment about having children being sociopathic. You are recruiting younger generation by birthing them so that this pyramid system can benefit you. If you create a child so that you may feel more hopeful about your own future, then I think it could be useful for you to consider the pyramid scheme analogy and pressure test your position. Another reason to have children is the intergroup reason. This is the group of good people who ought to have children. But the definition of good changes as per the person, and they usually define it such that they are included in that group of good people. It could be anything like God loving or civilized or tax paying or certain religion, certain caste, white, black, thinkers, artists, rich, poor, anything. And then they say that if these good people don't have children, then the other bad people will have children, and that will be bad. The stronger form of this is eugenics, and ironically, antinatalism is being constantly accused of being eugenic. Breeley says, to me, there is a crystal clear difference between asking questions about the ethics of choosing to create new humans versus the suggestion that some people should or shouldn't create new humans. This was really a nice article, and I'm not sure why she decided this to be her last piece on antinatalism. Bree, if you're listening, please write more on antinatalism. Another article about environmental antinatalism was Education in Times of Polycrisis, Bifurcations, Climatic Antinatalism, and New Eco-Pedagogies by Monica Humenuik. Polycrisis here refers to the multiple crises interacting together to produce dangerous consequences. Crises like climate change, economic instability, social inequality, demographic decline, and so on. All of these can result in an unfavorable world to live in. Humanity may be doomed to live in the shadow of cascading world destabilizing crises that cannot be analyzed in isolation. This will trigger complex and unpredictable processes and phenomena that call for novel strategies of systemic thinking and governance. Bifurcation in the title refers to the crossroads that we are at. Any wrong decision can lead to very bad future, so what do we do? Especially, how do we teach our children and what do we teach them? Monica is opposed to the idea of antinatalism for the reasons of climate change because it turns children into emission units, their birth and existence being quantified in tons of carbon dioxide. This approach radically instrumentalizes the body, treating it as a tool for production or reduction of greenhouse gases. This adds an additional layer of control to procreative decisions with. At the same time, it shifts responsibility away from larger systems and onto individuals. As the paper puts it, responsibility for the climate crisis is shifted onto individuals rather than economic and political systems. It raises questions about control. Reproduction is no longer just a personal decision, it becomes something shaped by power. In fact, reproduction is seen as a space in which the state, science, and capital can pursue their interests. So instead of giving a simple answer, the paper opens up a tension. On one side, there is real concern about the future of the planet. On the other, there is the risk of turning human life into a mere calculation and placing moral pressure on individuals while ignoring deeper systems. Because of these broader crises, the paper argues that even education needs to change. Instead of preparing us for a stable, predictable future, it should help us live with uncertainty and develop a shared responsibility and living with uncertainty. While the focus of this paper was education and teaching, I found it interesting that people are worried that environmental antinatalism or even ethical antinatalism can be used for controlling reproduction at the time when several countries across the world are incentivizing women to have more children and in some cases even demonizing women who don't want to. We shall see one more of such countries later, but for now, let's come back to yet another paper criticizing environmental antinatalism: The Carbon Footprint of Procreation, a Critical Review. As the title suggests, it is criticizing environmental antinatalism that is stemming from the concerns of climate change. There is a common antinatalist argument that having a child causes massive future emissions and therefore it is morally wrong or at least irresponsible to reproduce. This relies heavily on the carbon footprint of procreation, especially the claim that it's the largest individual climate action. The paper reviews 26 different studies that try to calculate how much carbon dioxide is caused by having a child. It shows that these huge impact numbers come from specific modeling choices. So the argument that having a child is equal to worst thing for climate becomes having a child might have a large impact under certain pessimistic assumptions. That's a big downgrade in strength. Calculating impact on emissions by having a child is very complex. There are many moving factors like whose emissions do we count? Only that of the child until she's a child or her lifetime emissions? If so, how to estimate them? Then there is a question of whether the emissions of her own children and so on are also considered. So, even though the paper is critical of the ideas of not having children for environmental reasons, it does not actually nullify antinatalism. I say that for a few reasons. One, the paper is questioning the quantities, like if the impact of having a child is big, then how big is it? If there are so many tons of extra carbon emissions, then how accurate is that figure, and so on. It does not deny that whatever imprecise impact there is on the climate of having a child, it can still be significant. Secondly, it does not consider the philanthropic side of environmental antinatalism. It only looks at how having a child impacts climate, but leaves out the question of how the child would be impacted by bringing her into a changing climate. Thirdly, there is nothing critical of ethical antinatalism. In fact, I would argue that this criticism of carbon emissions of having children bolsters the case of ethical antinatalism. If, say, the issue of climate change is fixed, we don't have environmental issue to worry about, and the civilization can continue with sustainable energy in future with no risk of abnormal climate events. Ethical antinatalism would argue that even in such situations, having children is wrong. Now, some news against antinatalism and child freedom in general. Last week, we saw how Russia is tightening its laws against women who want to remain child free. They will be sending those women to psychologists. Lawrence also made a video detailing the procedures and reports from multiple news sites. We also saw Vladimir Putin favoring early marriages and Russian authorities promoting school going girls to get pregnant under the guise of supporting pregnant teens. But this time, the news is from one of Russia's neighbors. No, not Ukraine, Belarus. It is one of the friendly nations to Russia and seems to be walking on the same path. Belta, which is a mainstream Belarusian news agency, reported on a new law which was approved by Belarusian National Assembly, which, among other things, will penalize anyone who is promoting homosexual relations, gender reassignment, childlessness, and pedophilia. LGBT organizations have already voiced their opposition to this, but penalizing childlessness is quite ridiculous. I could not find if they differentiate between voluntary childlessness and involuntary childlessness, but since the penalty is on promotion and not on being a childless person, I would assume that it is about voluntary childlessness. Although one could also be doing some promotions to get help for those who are involuntarily childless. Another interesting thing is that the way they club diametrically opposite ideas together. They are talking about childlessness and pedophilia together. One is about sexual offenses toward children, and another is about not exposing them to the risks of life, including being sexually harassed. One is about not considering the need of informed consent of children, and another one keeps consent as one of its central arguments. The authorities drafting this law and those supporting it don't seem to understand the harm they will be causing to the potential children. So the question is, why are they doing this? It is hard to know exact reasons, but I have some conspiracy theories. I looked at the demographics of Belarus. Like many other countries, its fertility rate, that is the average children per woman, has been below the required replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman since 1980s. In 2023, it went to its lowest before rising back in 2024 and 2025, but still far away from 2.1. The overall population of Belarus started declining in mid 90s when it reached the peak of over 10 million to just under 9 million now. Belarusian population is projected to continue declining to 7.4 million by 2050. This picture is not very different from some European, Asian, or American nations, but they are not penalizing people for promotion of childlessness or child-free ideologies. Why is Belarus doing this? Belarus is a friend of Russia, and although they are not at war like Russia is, they just want to follow their friend. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, who has been president of his country for more than 31 years, which is longer than the period of Putin's tenure as Russian president, is known to be a friend and ally of Vladimir Putin. This boomer uncle has some very traditional and troubling views about women and families. In his annual address to Belarusian people back in 2023, he said any popularization of the ideas of child-free families in our information and cultural space should be suppressed. He also thinks that children owe us more children for raising them. We have raised children who were provided with everything they needed, and now they want to live for themselves, choosing not to have kids for as long as possible. How dare they live the way they want to? They are young and they don't know enough. We, the older generation, can and must explain to them that life, success, and experience are meaningless when there is no one to pass them on to. That the wealth will not replace the happiness of seeing your family going on. We must explain this before we realize that it is too late for them to plan a childbirth. So, we, the older generation, know what these young kids don't. In other words, they are old enough to bring another human in this world, but at the same time, not old enough to decide for themselves. With such a head of state, I am not surprised that they are passing the laws to suppress child free, let alone antinatalists. And now on to Amanda Sukenick, who presented a paper in a conference at the Christchurch Newport University last month, which was titled Ephilism as Good Perversion, The Vice and Wisdom of Rejecting Life in Mary Eve's The Pain of Living. Earlier this week, I spoke to Amanda about this and her experience presenting in academic conferences, as well as about Needience. Let's hear what she said. Ephilism as a perversion. Is that the name of your paper? Is that right?
Ephilism as Good Perversion, the Vice and Wisdom of Rejecting Life in Marie Eo's The Pain of Living. And it's by both Mati and I.
So is the entire paper on Mary Ew? I am sorry, never get that
No, no,
right.
no, it's okay. Just let me say, I truthfully don't know if I'm pronouncing her name correctly either. I think it's Eo, but actually, I'm going off of Lawrence. Lawrence is the man on this one. Yes, I mean the paper is mostly examining Marie Eo as a very a fascinating, very important sort of obscure but figure in the history of antinatalism and animal rights, and it sort of notices that what she espoused is very similar to the contemporary antinatalism of ephilism, and sort of comparing the two, but also sort of taking a look at both in a an Aristotelian and neo-Aristotelian lens, which is something that both Mati and I have a big interest in, because it's something that really hasn't happened within antinatalist discourse all that much, if at all, and certainly not in the academic literature.
So you're trying to fit two figures. One is Mary Ew and another is Aristotle or Aristotelian ethics. Did Mary Ew in her lifetime actually write anything about Aristotelian ethics, or is it your work that you're trying to fit these?
Not that I know of. I don't believe that she did. I mean, one of the motivations of like why we would do such a thing, why we would attempt such a thing, goes back to the idea of this idea that Benatar's Benatarian antinatalism, from what he himself says about it, is theory neutral, that it can be examined from all these different normative theoretical lenses. And so we know that it's been examined through utilitarian normative lenses. We know that it's been examined through deontological normative lenses, but really not a whole lot, if at all, of virtue ethical lenses or Aristotelian lenses or neo-Aristotelian lenses or neo-Thomasian lenses, what have you. That is sort of unexplored territory, and it's very fascinating unexplored territory. It deserves to be it just deserves to be examined, whether those possibilities are there or not. Sort of try to investigate this idea of antinatalism as theory neutral, and why or why not there has been nothing from the Aristotelian camp insofar as an examination of antinatalism. Because you'd think that there would be a lot of at least rejections of antinatalism through certainly a neo-Aristotelian lens, and those don't exist. There's just been no points of contact between the two.
I thought in neo-Aristotelian world there are rejections of antinatalism. What was the name of the author? Elizabeth.
Anscombe. But Anscombe, so she has like a very she has a very interesting quote, and I know I'm misquoting her now, so my apologies to Liz Anscombe from Beyond. But like she has a quote about how like how can we possibly examine the idea of having children? The next thing on our menu will be like whether whether eating is correct or something like that. So she again, terrible paraphrase, but she equates the idea of like questioning whether we should eat, is the same level of ridiculousness as questioning whether we should have children or not. But all of those statements from neo-Aristotelian camps like that happened well before, as far as I know, happened well before the advent of contemporary antinatalism. So it wasn't responding to antinatalism specifically, as far as works that the neo-Aristotelians have done in response to the idea of limiting birth or no birth or anything like that. Now, one thing that is true is that both Aristotle did respond to the wisdom of Silenus. So there is that. We have that as far as through Plutarch and I think Sophocles. And we also have some response to sort of antinatalistic verses in the Bible. We know that Aquinas, commented on those in, I think, the Summa and other works. So again, those were long before the antinatalism that we know and love today. But as far as what bits and pieces of antinatalist like thinking existed within their times, they did make some response to that. So, but it's just interesting that contemporary Aristotelianism in its various forms hasn't really taken that up. This inquiry, I guess I could say it's a big part of the thesis that I'm working on. And, I don't necessarily expect to find, corollaries between possible antinatalisms within Aristotelian or Neo-Aristotelianism, but it deserves to be it deserves to be examined. If David Benatar's theory of neutrality is to be taken seriously, which I do take it seriously, then that immediately opens up the resources for this inquiry. And the bottom line is that antinatalism is not done. Like we typically get into stalemates sort of with each other, in terms of the community, sort of like the negative utilitarians versus the deontologists, and there's like. That's great, and like obviously, I come from that world and am deeply connected with those those sort of internal fisticuffs. But there's more to explore here. This is a subject that is not done. It is an emergent, growing field of inquiry, and like we should treat it that way, and we should be curious and try to connect it and see what kind of connections are available with other philosophies out there. And try to expand the conversation. So that's a piece of why Mati and I have taken such interest in this. Yeah.
Right. So this paper I know has been it's out in Finnish language. We talked about it.
Yes.
When is it going to be out in English?
I don't know. So that is a big unknown. So this paper had as many. This is total. Before I say anything else, this is totally like standard with trying to get papers published, as I have learned over the last like 2-3 years. You submit rejection, and then you just keep on trying. It's like anything else. It's exactly like what I experienced when I was trying to get the F list into film festivals and stuff. It's a whole lot of no's, and then you finally get a yes. So if I remember correctly, we wrote the paper, and then it was submitted to the American Philosophical Society Association, American Philosophical Association, the APA, at the Central Division and the Pacific Division. It was rejected from both of those, but as you know, I was a commentator at the Central Division earlier this year. I'm also going to be the Pacific Division is virtual, but I will also be chairing a session there. So it's kind of interesting the way things work out. So it didn't end up in those, and then we submitted to the Virtues and Vices of Having Children, which is the event that I presented at Christopher Newport University, and it was accepted there. I know that Eric Silverman, who is the one he's a professor at Christopher Newport University. He teaches philosophy. I think he teaches logic, if I'm not mistaken. He has put on a number of these events. Sorry, not at all to do with subjects in procreation. Each event has sort of had a different theme, and then there's a subsequent book that comes out of each conference session. The two books that came out previously, I'm not sure if I can show these, but Virtuous and Vicious Expressions of Partiality and Sexual Ethics in a Secular Age. And it remains to be seen whether our paper will be included in the subsequent book that comes out of this conference. If it doesn't end up in that publication, we'll just have to try it somewhere else. I'm not really sure, but yeah. So I don't know, unfortunately. When it will be out. But I will say that the lecture that I gave, it is a bit different than the paper itself because I don't remember when we wrote that paper. I think it was in late 2000. So it just happened like within such a short period of time. But I think it was in early 2025, and just like the research that I've done has taken different forms. So some of that was sort of added into the lecture form of it, specifically with like the topic of Needience and all of that, because I'm like headlong into my thesis now. So some of that is not included, when the English version is subsequently released. Some of those things won't be included in it. Yeah.
All right, we'll come to the Needience part. I have to ask about that. But before
Mm-hmm.
that, one is, how was your experience with that presentation at Christopher Newport University, if I'm saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
second question, you can answer these both together, is, has this paper or any of this shared with David Bennett, or have you had any reaction from
Well, I'll answer the first question first. No, I have not contacted David Benatar about any of this, so I don't know. I don't know what he'll think about any of it. That remains to be seen. And as for the conference itself, it was an amazing, wonderful experience. I had never been to Virginia, so that alone was lovely. Getting there was an absolute nightmare. 24 hours stuck in both the Chicago and Charlotte airports, weather problems, blah blah blah. And then the trip back was no better. Got diverted in midair to Cincinnati, stayed the night in Kentucky. Yeah, insane, absolutely insane. But yes, the conference itself was wonderful. It was absolutely fascinating because there were about 4 other antinatalists there, of various types and descriptions. So I wasn't all alone, but the rest of the cohort of the conference were like primarily fundamentalist Christians. There was a priest that gave a lecture. I actually unfortunately missed that, although I did get to meet him afterwards. And they all sort of a lot of their papers and a lot of their lectures had to do with sort of like Christian rejections of antinatalism and stuff. But it was really great because I mean, how often do you have fairly radical antinatalism coming into contact with like fairly radical Christianity, and being able to sort of share ideas, and it was all very friendly, and we shared meals together and vehemently disagreed with each other, but it was really wonderful. I got a lot out of it, and really, I mean, the tragedy of a lot of conferences, as I have only very recently learned, is that a lot of times things are sort of scheduled on top of each other. So like as you're presenting, somebody, 3 other people will be presenting their lectures in a different room, and you just don't get to see all that much. So there was a lot of different talks and lectures, and papers being presented at the same time, and you're only really able to see a sliver, um, of what actually is being presented. So there was so much that I wish that I could have seen. And as for now being on sort of the other side of going to conferences and presenting papers, like I kind of get why people don't make recordings, because you have to take into account some people are there presenting papers that will never be published, they don't have in mind to ever be published. Like it really is kind of, you're kind of lucky just to see sort of these one-off events of these, people just sort of getting feedback. As far as, moving forward, like, so long as I am allowed to, I will always record my lectures and stuff. I'm dedicated to that, but I get why people don't. I wish that like the whole conference had like its own YouTube channel and you could see every single one of the lectures. But it's just, it is the way it is.
But was your presentation the only presentation on antinatalism or for antinatalism?
No, a number of the people that presented on antinatalism that were pro antinatalist. I don't want to say their names only because I just don't know if they would like that. The one who I'm pretty confident wouldn't mind and would be proud and pleased is Blake Hareth, who has written a number of papers on antinatalism in the past. one of them in collaboration with, was it Ferrucci or something? I'm totally getting his name wrong. I apologize, but he was fantastic. I unfortunately like missed his lecture because I think he and I were presenting at the same time in different rooms. Um, but he presented like he is an antinatalist. Actually, it was funny. He came up to me and he was like, "Amanda, I actually was at your APA panel." Because I don't, you reported on it, Tejas. I was a commentator on someone else's paper called Antinatalism and Purity, and I hadn't ever realized like that. Blake Hareth was in the room. I never actually got to meet him. At the APA event, so it was just kind of marvelous seeing him again there, and finally getting to meet him. And so he did at least one. He did at least one lecture that was pro-antinatalist. Jimmy Lacone was also there. He's also written some pro-antinatalist papers as well, at least one. I'm blanking on the name of it right now. And like I said, there were two others. There was at least two others. The lecture that went right before mine in the same room as I was presenting in was a paper on how it's totally like raising your children in a fundamentalist Christian home is like totally okay. And then there was me. So it was like a very bizarre mix. Lovely guy. Very interesting paper actually, but yeah, it was a very I obviously I was the only ethicist there, so I was probably presenting the most egregious antinatalism of the group. But yeah.
Can we come to Needience?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
What is it? Why? Tell us about that.
Okay, so so again, in response to David Benatar's being stating that his antinatalism is theory neutral, that also opens up all kinds of different, not only normative positions but axiological positions as well. And so the idea that antinatalism can be based on not just suffering as an axiology. I mean, we know that Cabrera also, I mean, his sort of axiological basis is more in line with manipulation. It just opens it up to not only anthropocentric, sentiocentric, but the biocentric. It just gives the resources for that line of inquiry. He does talk about different levels of interest. He does talk about biotic interests, and he does make a statement somewhere in there about how he doesn't really have an argument for why biotic interests would have some relevance or some interest to certain people that make that argument. So I am not in any way proposing that plants, fungus have a consciousness, are aware, they suffer, but on a purely fundamental level, they can be in positive, negative states. There's nothing in those beings that has any sort of conscious awareness of being in a state of deprivation or satiation, but they can be in those states regardless. And so I would like to, part of what Needience posits is that that is not a neutral situation. The fact that life produces positive and negative states, it creates beings that either live or die, that can exist in a state of satiation or deprivation, is negative, even if there's nothing to experience that negative there. It's just if we're going to examine if we're going to formulate a truly all life antinatalism, like ephilism, but with the added concern for biocentric life, then we have to also consider what the state of biocentric life is. And the fact of the matter is, it can exist in a positive and negative state. Now, that is not to say that a needient being, the moral weight of a needient being in a state of deprivation is in any way equal to a sentient being in a negative state. That is, it is a hierarchy, and a needient is way the fuck below. Sorry, probably shouldn't swear on your channel, Tejas, but way the hell down here, and the moral panic that we should assign to a sentient being, existing in a state of deprivation, and suffering is way more important. But what than a needient being deprivated. But what I'm saying is that it's not neutral. That there is an inherent negative here, and that is something that is fundamentally doesn't cost us anything to recognize, as a piece of the negative that life just in the in the art of life rejection. We can without cost recognize that life does create positive and negative states at its most fundamental level, and that they are negative even if there isn't consciousness to scream about it.
Yeah, so I think I know what part of Bennett's Better Never to Have Been you're
Yeah.
referring to. He refers to four kinds of interests.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yes.
and he only considers the last two as being morally considerable. So
Yes.
the four kinds of interests are, one is an interest of inanimate objects, like it is in the interest of the car to have fuel in it,
Right.
for example.
Right.
Then the second type interest is the biotic interest, like the interest that you talked about, that it's in the interest of the plants to get watered, for
Right.
example. And then the third is the conscious interest, is in the sense that it is in the interest of the baby to not get hurt. And the last is the reflective. I don't know whether which one is called conscious, but the last one is a reflective interest, in the sense the person who has interest also is aware of those
Right.
interests, which is
Right.
sentient beings, or us, or humans. So these are the four
Yeah.
interests he talks about, and
Yeah.
I think you're referring to those. He only considers the last two,
Yeah.
the conscious interest
Yeah.
and the reflective interest, as morally relevant. And you seem to say that we also need to consider biotic interest for, at least as a
Yeah.
value. We're not talking about suffering, but as a different value. I'm just trying to simplify the word axiology here, because when you say
Oh, yeah,
axiological
yeah, yeah. Of
framework,
course. I'm
not
sorry.
everybody might
Yeah.
understand that. What does it
Where
mean that?
value can be placed, whether there is a value there to be respected, and so yes, you're absolutely correct, though. That is exactly the piece of Better Never to Have Been that I'm talking about. And he makes, rightfully so, he makes the conscious decision to say, I'm not talking about these types of beings. Any decisive argument that could engage and undermine the view that those who think that non-conscious biotic interests are morally relevant. Yet Benatar is notably candid about the limits of this line of reasoning. He discusses the moral relevance of non-conscious biotic interests. He acknowledges that those who reject this intuition can deny the crucial premise and insists that there may be non-conscious ways in which an entity's welfare can matter to it. He goes further still, conceding that he does not see any divisive argument that could engage and undermine the view of those who think that non-conscious biotic interests are morally relevant. So he can't. So it reveals some truly inability, that there is something there. He doesn't pursue it further. But again, I think that the theory of neutrality opens up at least the line of inquiry. That if Benatar's, as he says, is theory neutral, then it's not just normative theories that suddenly get opened up for inquiry for line of theoretical investigation. It's also axiological strains as well. And this is not only in response to Benatar; it is also in response to the earlier work of Matti Haire, who, in his book Liberal Utilitarianism and Applied Ethics, he also talks not specifically about biotic interests, but he talks about he brings up the example of tulips. In Liberal Utilitarianism and Applied Ethics, which was Mati's book from 1994, he has this quote. At this point, Hyrie emphasizes the implication of von Wright's own view. According to von Wright's view, von Wright was another Finnish philosopher. All living beings have needs that are related to survival and flourishing, and at least all higher animals are prone to have contingent needs or desires. Thus, for instance, human beings may need education to cope in the modern society, woodpeckers may need forests to survive, and tulips may need fertilizer to bloom. But are all these needs equally relevant to morality? If a choice must be made between the basic needs of a human being and a tulip, is the decision maker confronted with a tragic dilemma? According to the four principles which define the importance of mutual relationships of needs, i.e., principles AD, I don't have those in front of me, so I apologize. The answer to both of these questions is in the affirmative. So you have two very important, seminal antinatalist philosophers who at least skirt this as a possible inquiry into, their antinatalism, and also the subject of needs is very familiar territory and a very familiar language because of Effelism. Effelism, I think, also in addition to having a sentiocentric axiological basis, also has a need-based axiology. I think it behaves a little different than the way that maybe Benatar and certainly Mati are positing it. I think if Effelism has a need-based axiology, it maybe behaves a little closer to more of like a Schopenhauerian kind of sense, but there's still similarities there, and there's still a point of investigation there. And even though classical Effelism is, pretty staunchly and very stubbornly sentiocentric, and rightfully so, I just don't think that it really. I think that it's a perfectly rational thing to notice that, again, life at its most fundamental level creates biotic states of lack, and that's not a good thing. If we're going to if we're going to completely flip the word life around to its backwards, we have to consider everything that life creates, not just what feels pain and suffering, but notice that, hey, this creates bad situations, no matter what the other details of the being are.
I have a last question, but I think you've already answered. So let me phrase that answer and you tell me whether that is right or wrong. So my question was going to be in that hierarchy of interests of Benatar, from inanimate interests to biotic interest to conscious to reflective. If you're also going to consider biotic interest in your framework, in your value based theory, then why stop there and why not also consider inanimate interest? And I think the answer could be two things. One is we're talking life and aphilism, so inanimate by definition is not life. And the second is you seem to have titled this as needience, which is more need based, so needs and interests,
I think
that
you
might be a
answered
difference
your own
in
questions
these two. Is
perfectly.
that right?
So this is an examination of things that are alive. I would like to. I mean, in further pursuits, I would like to examine inanimate objects. I think that there is some corollary there between like anti-AI natalism. I mean, they're not alive, but they imitate life. So like I think some of that inquiry is already sort of happening. Like, but whether something that is inanimate and something that imitates life is the same thing. I mean, obviously I that's to be pulled apart later. So I don't think that my thesis per se is going to get into those territories, just because again, especially if we're viewing things in a Aristotelian, neo-Aristotelian lens, I want to stick with things that do specifically deal with it, that are alive, that are biotic in some ways, that are sentient, that are a feature of life. that are creations of life. But I do think that that extended focus has all kinds of play that should be investigated further later on, for sure.
I think that's interesting because you're opening a Pandora's box, because then you go into, should should this be restricted to physicalism or materialism? You go into metaphysics, and can there be something beyond just the material things that we sense? And I forget that philosopher's name who has investigated this, but there is a range of philosophers who always have said that there is
Mm.
something else which is beyond space time, and we can only sense through space time, through our senses,
Well,
which are our interfaces. And then it opens up, I don't know, like very big area to explore. So it's quite complex.
people are already sort of using those as arguments against antinatalism, right? Like, I mean, that there might be things that we are beyond our control, and so it's like it's only rational that like we also have access to those same ideas, and they should be interpreted. I mean, antinatalism is not something that's going to be constrained by any of these things in the future. It should be opened up to every line of inquiry because it's a massive emergent field. I mean, so I don't think we should be afraid of that or try to hem it in. I mean, these things get a little contentious when we start to consider um the extinctionist side of things, and it's like, what are you going to do about it? And like we gotta, or like, the argument that has been given to me a number of times about Needience by vegans is like, well, we got to eat something, and it's like it's not a this is not a dialectic. This is not a manifesto about how this whole thing generates a pro-mortalism and you can't eat plants anymore because you can't you can't you can't frustrate their needience. You know what I mean? Like, part of the point is that you're not going to get, if you're alive, you're not going to do this thing cleanly. You're either going to always be stepping on somebody's sentience or somebody's needience, and that only strengthens the argument for why it shouldn't exist in the first place. Um, yeah. So, but anyway, I again, I really, really don't think that um, we have too big a tendency in the antenatal world to like try to create these sort of intellectual boundaries, and I think that we need to allow ourselves to at least in the theoretical space open it up as wide as possible, leave no stone unturned. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. So yeah.
Amanda, thanks for your time. Thanks for spending time about this. And we hope to see that paper is published in English soon.
Absolutely, absolutely, lots coming. Mati and I have a million papers on the way, and yeah, all kinds of stuff.